In a previous video, we looked at Amazon Cognito custom attributes. We learned how to set them up and also manually update them from the AWS Console. In this video, let's learn how to set these custom attributes from your .NET applications. This means you can keep these attributes up to date based on real events that happens within your application and those that requires updating the Cognito attributes. This also enables you to have some of these properties across in your application claims as we've seen in the previous videos in this Cognito series. Hello and welcome to this channel. My name is Rahul and I make videos on .NET, Cloud and DevOps. This one's a part of my Amazon Cognito series and a big shout out to AWS for sponsoring this. Here in Rider, I have the ASP.NET Web API application that we have been working so far in this series. I have added a new endpoint to our application that is a user subscribe endpoint. You can think of this endpoint where the user interacts with our website and subscribes to our subscription. Now, in this case, let's say once we have taken the money and activated the subscription, we need to update our users' claims so that it reflects that they are now a paid user. Now, in a more real-world application, when the user subscribes, you would be raising an event which says user subscribed event, and as a reaction to that event, you can go and update your Cognito claims. But to keep things simple, I'll directly do this within this API endpoint. However, if you're really interested in learning the messaging pattern, I highly recommend checking out my messaging series, which will be linked here and also in the descriptions below. So let's get back to the problem at hand. So we need to update our custom attributes in here when the user subscribes. For this, let's start by adding in a NuGet package. Now we need to be talking to the Amazon Cognito via the .NET SDK so that we can start updating and changing the properties on Cognito. So under the Manage NuGet Packages, we can search for Cognito and add the AWS SDK Cognito Identity Provider. So make sure that is added to your project, and let's also add the AWS SDK.NET NuGet package, which allows us to set up dependency injection. Now, I have a completely separate video where I walk through on how to set up dependency injection for AWS SDK using .NET and using this package. So check that out if you want to learn more about dependency injection and how that works under the hood. So I have both of these packages added to our CSproj application. So let's start using them. Now, within the subscribe method, we first need to get the user's name, which is already part of the claim. So let's get that as username, and let's get this from the HTTP context, which is already getting injected in here. So let's use the HTTP context, user.claims, and let's get the first or default where the value for the claim that is of type username. So let's check for username as the claim type. Now let's go and create a request to update the custom attributes. Now if I switch back to AWS Console, under our user pool, we have the users here. And let's say we are going to update the admin users details. Now in here, we don't have any subscription on this specific user. We have that as a custom attribute that we added in the previous video where we introduced about custom attributes. We can click add attributes and look at this property, which is custom subscription. So let's say that's the property we're going to set. Let's come back to Rider and create a new request to make the custom attribute update. So let's call this as attribute update request, and let's create a new admin update user attribute request. Now this is coming from the NuGet package, Cognito Identity Provider, that we just added. So let's create the request. We need to specify the user pool ID, which you can get from the application configuration, which we will update in a second. Let's also update the username, which now we have the username in here using the claim. And let's also update the user attributes that we need to change. So this takes in a list of attributes that you can pass into this. So let's create the attributes that we need to update. Now in this specific case, we need to update the custom subscription attribute. So let's specify custom subscription as the attribute name. We also need to specify the value, which we will leave as premium. Now we have created a new request. We need to specify the user pool ID. So if you switch back here, you can go to the user pools and get the ID of that user pool. So you can go all the way to the user pool and copy this user pool ID. Now let's right now hard code this here, but you can move this to a configuration and get it from there like we did when we set up the authentication inside the application. So now we have the attribute update request. So let's use the Amazon Cognito identity provider that is being injected into the function, and let's use this to update Cognito. So let's call the Cognito identity provider admin update user attributes async method, which takes in the attributes update request. So let's pass that and let's make sure to await on this. Now, we need to make sure that the Amazon Cognito identity provider is getting injected into our dependency injection so that it gets resolved appropriately. So let's scroll back up, and where we are registering the services, let's also make the call to add services, and let's specify add AWS service and pass in the Amazon Cognito identity provider. Now, we walked through this in a previous video on how this dependency injection works. But all you need to know is that the provider will get injected and we will have access to it. So let's put a breakpoint here and let's run this application. The application is running, so let's switch to our HTTP file where I have the admin users token already updated. Let's call this new endpoint, which is user subscribe. So now this is going to hit our endpoint, and first it's going to get the username. So in this case, we get the attribute ID for the user from the token. Now we create the attribute update request, and we are using the identity provider to make the request. Now the request is successful. So if we switch back to our console and let's navigate to the users inside the user pool, and let's go to the admin user. Now here you can see that the custom subscription attribute is successfully added and it is set to the value of premium. Now we are able to update this attribute because when we created the attribute, we set the property as mutable. Now if you had created the custom attribute as non-mutable, in this case, you would not be able to update the attribute. You will only be able to set that when you're initially creating the user. So if you navigate back to the user, you can see there are properties that you cannot edit and update. For example, the sub attribute on the user. This is the username that we just retrieved back from the claim, which is also the user ID in Cognito. However, you can update the other properties, which are like locale, username, etc. from your application code. Now, if I switch back to our application, let's stop this. We can create a new attribute type in here, and let's say we need to update the locale property. Let's pass that as the property name. And in this case, let's make this as ENAU. Let's save this and run the application again. Let's go to our HTTP file and make a request on the subscribe endpoint. Now this is going to hit the API endpoint, create the request, and make the call with identity provider. So let's switch back and let's refresh this to see the new value. So here you can see that the value has been updated to EN-AU. So you can update multiple attributes in the same request, or you can also choose to update the custom attribute and also the actual default attributes that already exist on the user. If you're liking the video so far, please make sure to hit the like button. It also helps me spread the word and grow this YouTube channel. Now, in certain scenarios, you might also want to add other things, like maybe you want to change the users group or even associate another group to this specific user. Now, let's say in case of subscription, we can add the user to the premium users group. Now, you can do this from the application code as well. So rather than manually coming to the console and adding this, you can make sure that the things happening inside your application automatically updates your Cognito to keep that in sync. So let's come back to our writer application, and in this case what we need is to create another request. So let's make another request right below here, and let's call this add user to group request. In this case, we need to call the admin add user to group request and specify the user pool ID, which is exactly the same as before, which you'll need to move it into a configuration, specify the username, and let's also specify the group that we need to add it to, which is premium users. Let's make sure that is the correct name. Yes, that is. Now, once we create the request, we need to make sure that we call the await Cognito identity provider and call the method admin add user to group async and pass in this request. So that is the add user to group request. And let's run this to see this in action. Let's invoke our endpoint subscribe again. In this case, it's going to hit the breakpoint. It's adding the attributes and also adding the user to the group. Now, if we come back to our AWS console, let's refresh this, and you can see here that the admin user is now also part of the premium users. Now, the next time they log in, these information is going to update in their claims, and you can use that within your application. You can also perform other functions on your Cognito User Pool that you would normally do from the console. Now, this can be removing from a group, verifying email, updating users' name, resetting for password, etc. But now that you understand the basics of how to make these changes, I will leave that to you to explore and figure out, and based on your application needs. If you want to be notified of similar videos, please make sure to hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you, and see you soon in the next video.